It's like being part detective, part psychologist, part dominatrix.
They didn't like metal, they didn't like punk.
Lester did an interview with Charles Mingus.
I was going to make my national writing debut.
Turned out to be a non-paying position.
He sent me the tape and the transcription.
I did the first story in the Police that we ever ran.
One of the clever things we did, and a long series of not so clever things that we did, was to offer inexpensive advertising to bands that were putting out their own records.
Did we get any respect as rock writers?
Going out on the road and covering artists.
Absolutely.
Write it down, write it down, write it down.
The only reason anybody remembers the 1960s and 70s is because somebody had the audacity to write it all down. And those were the rock writers.
There were millions and millions of people doing this.
Nick Tosh's and Lester Bangs.
Hunter Thompson.
They also were writing for Rolling Stone, but it was a very different voice.
Dave Marsh.
Paul Williams, was the founder and publisher.
He started Crawdaddy as a subscription newsletter.
John Landau.
Robert Christgau, Greil Marcus, Ellen Willis.
Who put the bop?
Cream.
Phonograph Record Magazine.
James Walcott was writing in the Village Voice.
Zoo World.
Anybody would be honored to have John Lennon say that you were his favorite critic. I just thought it was really sad that, Lester didn't live long enough to see that.
It's like a cat and mouse thing with the critics and the musicians.
1966 to the early 80s really was the golden age of music journalism. For 15 years or so, the counterculture was in control.
I wrote a piece on Brian Wilson and the Hawaiian entertainer Don Ho being separated at birth.
1967, I wrote the first U.S. review of Jimi Hendrix. Ran into him after that. He says, "Oh man, were you stoned when you wrote that? That was really fantastic."
Being able to interview The Clash over in London.
Everything about Led Zeppelin was bigger than life. Like they were ruder, more excessive, did more drugs.
Jim Morrison was going to have a costume or an outfit made out of the fetus of a horse.
Because he had the cojones.
Paul decided to start a new magazine.
Ronnie Van Zant came to my defense. He said, "Come over here, we'll talk."
He always considered it a noble failure.
They had announced at the show that Leonard Skinner had a plane crash, and I knew he hadn't survived.
There's a protest thing that's going to have the Dead in it.
You've written about the Sex Pistols too much.
This guy told me he's forming another band.
Alternative Press said they would run it.
So I saw this fantastic chick there.
And the publisher lied to me that they paid their writers $100 or something per article.
There's going to be a free concert.
So I became the first paid writer for Alternative Press.
And from that, along with some clips from the British newspapers, create the next issue of Rolling Stone.
There were inevitable rivalries depending on the cities they lived in, the publications they wrote for, and their own musical tastes. All the while, the backdrop of the Vietnam War and other turmoil pushed the political tensions to their limits.
Like when Joe Strummer took your little portable Sony cassette recorder and...
Yeah, he smashed it because he didn't like my line of questioning.
How does Adam Ant's manager feel about, being taken captive by Michael Jackson?
Rolling Stone was political from the get-go.
And it was attracting professional writers.
It's really been a piece of shit since 1968.
We were dancing with the women.
Rolling Stone's music coverage has always been corrupt to its commercial interests.
I think it would be a good idea if you guys kind of moseyed on out of here.
Real Marcus was bounced out.
And we beat it out of there.
One of the turning points for me was Kent State. When these kids were killed, shot, I said, that's it. I'm not going to die for it.
The 60s didn't really take place in the 60s. Something happened when Nixon resigned. We had slain the father figure, We had gotten rid of the president of the United States. And it felt a little bit like we had done it. I would start it in 64 and I would go till when did Nixon resign? 74. There's your 60s.
Record companies showered the rock critics with lavish parties, promos, and free records. Some of the journalists even became as legendary as the rock stars themselves.
A lot of stuff that people think Lester did, actually Dave Marsh did. The infamous throwing a typewriter, that was Dave Marsh, it wasn't Lester.
Getting Lou Reed to talk, Lester was able to do that.
There's a few cities in this country that have their own culture.
He was a Detroiter.
I was such a New York snob.
The fuck you always won.
San Francisco.
Rolling Stone did not want to have much to do with punk.
I kind of dated from Patti Smith.
And that is where punk came in.
The Dictator's first record.
It was stocked in record stores.
Then they would do a focus group and everybody would hate heavy metal and
It was the template for Beavis and Butthead.
That was another scene that was picked up by the critics.
How the underground press survived was by running record reviews and loads of ads from the record companies.
Some of the record labels had suites.
We used them, they used us.
Dylan played him a new song.
Lester just kept calling up this guy's room to have the guy answer Patrick Snyder's Scumpy.
The death of rock and roll really was MTV.
it'll be interesting to see how all that social media and television and all this new media kind of congeals.
Music took a back seat. Image became more important than the music.
The revolutionary aspects of music are harder and harder to delineate.
I think that was the last interaction that Paul had with Dylan.
It was like we all heard this shrill dog whistle and we all ended up at the same place and we found our group, we found our tribe together.
I'd love to hold a hard thing in my hand again, you know, a hard cream thing in my hand again. You know?
There's just no way to say that properly?
Yes, thing, a hard thing.